You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's story, certainly a different one than we've ever told. In fact, a story from the other side of the fence about a soldier in the German army during World War II and his story told through his daughter's experience. We'll get to that coming up in a moment. Just an incredible story about World War II and so many different layers to it. I was excited when it was brought to me that we could share this story. But our normal announcements first, as always, please continue to follow us on all the social media sites. Grow that social media following with us. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at Hazard Ground Podcast. Make sure you guys subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. Give a thumbs up and a like to all the content there. We appreciate all you guys getting us up to over a couple of 4,000 subscribers now. Let's keep those numbers growing. We certainly appreciate it. As well, continue to leave us Apple reviews. They help grow the show as well. Doesn't have to be a lengthy review. Just give us 5 stars. Tell us why you love the show. Quick thumbs up, and certainly we'll try to post some of those reviews on social media. So we appreciate you guys giving us love and support. As well, go to our website, hazardground.com, for our Amazon promotion. On the website, you can click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab. It'll redirect you to Amazon. You do all your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. We appreciate all the love and support as well. Okay, this week's guest is the daughter of a former soldier in the German Army. She has written a book called Save the Last Bullet, Memoir of a Boy Soldier in Hitler's Army. And just the background here, this is the story of about a young boy who was taken away by the Nazis at 13 years old during World War II and then sent off to fight in the German army for the Third Reich against the Americans. Very unusual, because we usually tell the story of all combat experience from us being on the good side, right? Not us being, the protagonists. But this is just an interesting story here as well. And his daughter is here to tell it and promote her book and share the story that I thought was incredibly interesting to hear. Plus, as well, discuss what it is like to be the daughter of somebody who has PTSD, is a topic that we've spoken a lot about here on the show. And she is Heidi Langbein, joining us here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Heidi, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, and welcome for having me.
Yes. Again, you and I had a chance, and just some background here for the audience. Because when I was first presented with this story, it's like, well, hey, we've never really kind of, typically these aren't the kind of stories we do. We like a first-person account of this story. But, when you and I started talking, you were telling me about your father's experience. I'm like, wow, there really is a lot of legs to this. And I genuinely think the audience is going to love this. So your father's name, Willie Langbein, was taken away from his parents at the age of 13 by the Nazis. Kind of give us the background as you know it, and what you've learned about, your father growing up as a young boy.
Yeah, so in the Third Reich, children were targeted for indoctrination at a really early age, because that was the Nazi strategy, to get the kids at a very young age to buy into the Nazi ideology, right? And so from the age of really starting school, school books were already geared, to idolize Hitler and the Nazi ideology. And then, and it was very insidious, because it was children's stories, and the teachers would ask very pointed questions of children 6, 7 years old, really inciting them to tell on their parents, right? They would say, I'm sure your parents say the same good things about, Hitler here at your house as they do in school, don't they? And so if the child said, well, not really, then they literally would go and investigate the parents. So it started at that age already. Then you go into 10 years old, children were in particular boys, of course, were targeted. They went into an youth organization called Jungvolk. So it's kind of like, Boy Scouts, And that's how it was touted, lots of games and lots of activities, but they all had a military connotation, and a lot of flag salutes and marches, and so in preparation already for paramilitary training. At age 14, boys then went into the Hitler Youth and that was indeed, really military preparation. And then at age 18, they were automatically, during wartime, enrolled into the Wehrmacht.
What did your father tell you about the experience of being taken away from his parents? How did that all go down? Do you know the exact details?
Yeah, I do. And so by the time my father was 9 in 1939, the enrollment in the Jungvolk, which started at 10 years old, was no longer voluntary. It had become mandatory. So it wasn't a choice. Same with the separation. So the separation from children at a young age, from as young as age 10 to obviously through school age, was called Kinderlandverschickung, and it's a program. It's basically translated as children's country relocation program. It was touted as a vacation for city children and protection from Allied bombing, whereas in reality, it was part of the Nazi strategy to separate the children from the church and from the parents as much as possible and put them in areas where they could completely control the messaging that they were getting.
All right, so you said at 9 years old, your father was already in this program, and he's taken away at 13. Just some higher math here. That brings us right to the middle of World War II. We're sitting here in 1943. So what do you know about once he was 13 and taken away? Like, what sort of military training did he get? Are you aware of any of it?
Yeah. So, and one thing I'll add too is that children's relocation program also was touted as voluntary, and it wasn't. So right. By the time my father was enrolled, his parents had no choice because the Nazis had made it illegal for parents to keep children out of school. So they had to be enrolled in school, but they had closed all the schools in the cities of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is Westphalia, which is where my father was from. There were no schools open. So basically, the parents were committing an illegal act, so they had to put the children in the relocation program. Although the parents were not very enthusiastic about it, they were very concerned, obviously, to have children disappear and not know where they were. And that's what happened. So he was put on a train on July 21st of 1943. And that's the last time that he saw his parents for a while. He actually escaped his handlers at Christmas time in 1943, and jumped on a train, which was forbidden, and I can talk about that. And he got in trouble, obviously, for that. And then that was the last time he saw his parents until much, much later in 1945.
What do they do for trouble? I mean, I'm trying to think of a worse trouble than being sent to war.
That was a precursor of the trouble that you get yourself into. So he was relocated to Lake Constance, which is on the Swiss border, very far from Westphalia. It's really on the other end of Germany, and it's in the deep south. And at Christmas time, he was so homesick, he decided to get on a train and go to the city of Witten, where his parents lived. His father had sent him, and that maybe tells you a little bit of the naivete of the German population to some extent. His father had sent him a train ticket, because his father was actually a German Railways employee. So he'd sent him a ticket to go visit, and he didn't realize that was not permitted. But, he was so homesick that he took the chance. So he actually, with the help of his host family, got on the train unnoticed, past the guards and the police. So you had the Hitler Youth Guards patrolling and the police. the Feldgendarmerie is what they were called in the Hitlerjugend, were patrolling the train station so that nobody would get into that kind of mischief or try to escape. So he made it. And when he got back, they, in January, they were waiting for him. So obviously they'd identified that he was missing. There was a search out for him. They intercepted him as soon as he got off the train. Now his is a 13-year-old kid. So he gets put in handcuffs. He gets taken to a back room somewhere at the train station, the typical room with the one light bulb and the one chair. And he's interrogated, and he is being accused of being a spy. So he's absolutely terrified at this point. He's being manhandled. He's not beaten, but he's being manhandled, and he's left in that room by himself, handcuffed to that chair for hours. And so he's, of course, absolutely traumatized. And after several hours, they go back in and they tell him, okay, we've decided we're going to let you off this time with just a small punishment. And so he was mandated, and this was actually very common, to clean the public restrooms at the train station for 2 weeks with a toothbrush. So
okay, we've done stuff like
that. And so that was
I think back in the day in the American Army we did stuff like that. So that's okay.
So
all right.
but then fast forward, so the stuff obviously gets, the situation gets bad. The bombing reaches the south of Germany. They then take the children to a very remote location in the mountains of Bavaria. And at that point, my father and two other kids that are, tall and strong, get specifically picked out and selected by the SS. The SS comes to visit and says, "You three, you're coming with us and going to military training because you are now being selected to protect the fatherland and to put your life down on the line for the Fuhrer."
So again, and the higher math here is that he's 13 years old at 43. The war ends in 45. So
that's right.
They have now sent a 14-year-old into combat.
Yeah. So Chrisley was about
like
Christmas 44 when he gets selected. He gets sent to that training. No, September. Sorry, it was September 44. So he gets sent to two months intensive training. They were taught how to handle a Panzerfaust, which is the equivalent of a bazooka. It's a one-time weapon, so it can only be fired once, and penetrates the hull of tanks and explodes inside, as you probably know. Then they were also taught to handle the Sturmgewehr, which was, according to my father, was the first machine gun that was able to fire, at, I think it was 100 meters or 1,000 meters, I'm not sure. And also trained in handling pistols.
All right. I mean, I'm still wrapping my brain around the concept that even if there was a 14-year-old who wanted to go to war, how effective could they ultimately be?
Well,
in combat, on the bright side for the good guys, it was that dire of a situation for Germany.
That's right.
That they needed 14-year-old conscripts to sign up and fight.
Yeah.
Did your dad ever talk about kind of what he was thinking and feeling about this? Like, I mean, is he, I feel like I'm going to die here kind of deal, or what do you know about that experience for him?
Yeah, so they were heavily indoctrinated, and they were shown, when they had the training, it started, usual training, right? It'll start at 6 in the morning and dawn to dusk. They didn't get much food because there wasn't much food around. So, and they were shown constant reels of newsreels of victorious Germany and how Germany was actually winning the war. So they had actually no idea that they were losing because they're kids, right? And so they're being told that they're winning and that that they were superior fighters and that they needed to sacrifice their lives for the Führer in defense of Germany against the Russian attack. So they were already being prepared. This is the end of 44. And then in March, with great apprehension, but also with this sense of duty now that had been, inculcated into them, that this was the duty for their country. They had to defend their country. And so they shipped them off. My father actually was sent to the front, arrived at the front, at the Eastern Front, which was in Austria at the time, at actually the gates of Vienna. So he was not aware of how momentous that actual precursor battle was that he was in. He was in the last battle before the Battle of Vienna. And the last battle before the Battle of Vienna was at Wiener Neustadt, where the Ukrainian army defeated the Germans and pushed them into retreat and then went into Vienna.
Was your father aware of the concentration camps and what had gone on to all the Jews?
Yeah, absolutely no idea. So he did, however, as young as 8, he didn't understand it then, but much later when he found out what really went on, realized that he had actually witnessed Kristallnacht, the aftermath of Kristallnacht. His father was actually dragging him away from the action in the early morning hours of after Kristallnacht, when
explain to people who don't know what Kristallnacht is.
Kristallnacht is so that's the night of the broken glass, and that is the night or evening really, and that prompted so-called spontaneous attacks against Jewish businesses and synagogues and people. Thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed that night, as well as hundreds of synagogues around the country. In really what was a staged attack. It was purportedly a spontaneous outrage of the German people against an action that an insurgent Jew had taken against a German government official, an ambassador, whom he actually killed. And so this was supposedly the spontaneous attack of the German people reacting to this. It was staged. It was staged, and it's been proven that it was staged. But then, of course, mass hysteria did contribute to the terrible destruction that night. So my father remembers that his father, in the early morning hours, because he needed to take him to school, was taking a detour and held him, at the railway station where he worked for a while. And my father wasn't sure what was going on, but he could see fire. And then when they went to school, they actually ran into the Witten synagogue, which hadn't burned to the ground, and the firefighters were still there. And there was a lot of commotion, and my father was very shocked. And he was 8, but he had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. And then there was a family that my grandparents were friends with, who was Jewish and had a shoe store. And my father actually spent a lot of time there as a child, because my grandmother and the woman were very good friends, and the woman would babysit my father and together with her young child. And that family, unfortunately, underwent great hardship. My grandmother actually helped hide the wife and the child in their coal cellar at the very end of the war. The husband was taken to the concentration camp Theresienstadt, but luckily survived. And they are still there today. So he returned on foot to Witten because his wife was German. She was Aryan, and he was Jewish. They mandated the wife to divorce the husband. She refused. And this is why she didn't get sent to the concentration camp only he did, but she and her child were destitute, and they weren't allowed even to have food rations or food stamps. And they would have been taken away at the very end of the war had they not been helped by our family. And then the gentleman decided to actually stay in Germany, which is very rare.
Wow.
There were only 400, the town was not very big. There were only 427 Jewish residents, of which 2/3, either were killed or managed to escape. And then very few then remained and went back. And that shoe store still exists today. And I was privileged to talk to the granddaughter, who is about my age, just recently in June. And she corroborated
Wow.
the story. Yeah.
That's amazing. All right. So your 14-year-old father is sent off to the Eastern Front Lines. His combat experience, which again, is, I'm still wrapping my head around a 14-year-old just even shouldering a bazooka to fire it, but neither here nor there. What do you know about his actual combat experience and what he saw?
Yeah, so March 31st, so they're being pumped up to, I guess is typical in the military, they're going to battle. They get there. He is scared out of his wits at this point because he hears the first cannon up close and he just loses it. But then, they're told to dig foxholes for themselves at about 10 meters distance of each other, and about about close to 6 feet deep, or more or less 6 feet deep. So, as deep as they could dig them to kind of, be as tall as they were. So they dig the holes, and then they are issued 4 Panzerfaust each, and they have their Sturmgewehr and they have their pistol. They are told to keep the last bullet, to save the last bullet for themselves, to not get taken prisoner by the Russians, because the Russians, being taken prisoner by the Russians, they were told was a fate worse than death, because they would be tortured and then killed. So that's why, the title of the book, right? And
That's
so
that's like in all my years of military training, I've never heard of anything like that. Like, okay, so just a sort of comparison aside, I remember getting a briefing when I was my first deployment in Iraq, and the briefing about being captured was very brief and very quick, and basically they just said don't, right? Just don't get captured. Like that's and we were told fight until they kill you on the spot. Like, just don't let them capture you, because nobody wanted that experience. We were hearing about beheadings and everything else, but no one would have ever given us the idea of save a bullet for yourself and kill yourself instead of being like that. To me is a level of mental twisting that is I'm wow.
Yeah, it was, and then also the instructions on the Panzerfaust, because it was, it could only be fired once, and they only had 4. So there was a replenishment truck somewhere in the back, but good luck, right? I mean, yes, you had better run really fast to get replenishments, but that you would be probably going to get killed if you tried to do that. So they weren't really expected to survive. And then the instructions, he always was telling me the instructions that he had received were, one was that one, and the other one was that they had to make sure that the tank was at exactly 20 meters of distance, because that was the only safe distance to fire it successfully, to fire the weapon successfully. But exactly,
that's really close to be next to a tank, for the record.
What's that? 20 meters? That's real close.
Really, that's really close to be next to a tank for the
Yeah, that's
okay.
really close.
All right.
And at 20 meters, the hull would successfully penetrate the tank, and I understand that it was very, very powerful, and could penetrate like 8 centimeters of metal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But if they shot it and the tank was too far away, they would miss the mark, and they wouldn't have time to reload another weapon and aim it and fire it in time, because then it would get too close. And if it got too close, they basically would get run over by the tanks. And he witnessed that happen to several of his fellow soldiers.
Wow. All right. So the battle starts, and what is he experiencing? What is he seeing? I mean, does he actually get to fire?
Oh yeah.
Any weapon?
Oh, he
Okay.
fired them all. So he was a very good marksman. Luckily, he had extremely good aim. He had figured out a way to target a marker that would be at approximately 20 meters. He looked at this boulder and he estimated it was about 20 meters. So he waited until the tanks arrived, at that 20-meter mark before he fired. He was, absolutely terrified, but he had no time. He said he had no time to be terrified. They didn't have time to be scared. He had to he was in action mode, I guess, and just did what he needed to do. And he said it was a wall of tanks. He felt the rumble, through his body. He saw the grenadiers behind the tanks, right? The grenadiers with the bayonets were behind the tanks, and they were going to go into hand-to-hand combat after the tanks, had rolled over, as many people as possible, which is exactly what happened. So they were outmanned and outgunned and overwhelmed. He did fire off his 4 and hit the mark every time. That's why he survived. And some of his fellow soldiers were not that lucky. And, he witnessed in fact, the one who was his friend, he was one of his schoolmates being run over by one of the tanks right next to him.
Oh, God.
And yeah, and then he realized, that this was a really, really bad situation. He started firing his machine gun because the grenadiers were advancing. I remember he looked to his left, and I don't know at what point that was. He felt heat on his left. And when he looked, the other person to his left in the other foxhole had been beheaded by, some weapon. And so he realized he better get out and try to fight his way out of the situation. Ran out of bullets on his machine gun and was in fact left with his pistol, and was on his last bullet. And he looked down in a moment of uncertainty. And when he looked up, he had a grenadier in his face. And he was a Russian soldier. He figures he was about the same age. He must have been maybe 15, 16 years old. And he was aiming with his bayonet to his stomach. He was going to, impale him with his stomach. And my father had the presence of mind to push the machine gun at him, and that diverted the bayonet to his leg. And so it sliced his calf from knee to bottom to his foot open. And at that point, the soldier was surprised for a second and tried to pull the bayonet out of his leg, at which point my father then fired the gun into, he shot him in the head and killed him.
So, but your father is obviously bleeding profusely at this point in time.
Profusely. He was bleeding out.
What does he do next?
He was bleeding out. Yeah.
What does he do next?
So he's sitting, he's dazed, he sits down for a second, and there were Italian grenadiers. The Italian Bersaglieri division was supposed to be actually in behind the Germans, and they were supposed to come in and provide reinforcements and support. That never happened. And so he starts hearing commotion and retreat. And so he tries to get up. He sees how much he's bleeding. He realizes he's getting weaker. And he's very lucky. He's seen by 2 of his fellow soldiers who actually help him get out. One of them, they're running at this point. They're running at top speed. And one of them manages to, rip off, I guess, some piece of cloth from his uniform and puts a tourniquet on my father's leg to help him, and he barely remembers making it into the woods. But with the adrenaline pumping, he's able to run to cover. At which point he collapses and the medics take care of him. And they didn't have any antiseptics at this point. They had nothing left. And so they pour horse urine on his wound because that's all there was, in the hopes that he wouldn't get, gangrene. And luckily for my father, it worked.
I didn't know that horse urine had septic properties.
It's antiseptic. Yeah,
properties.
It has antiseptic properties because it is, I guess it is considered sterile.
Yeah.
At the moment, basically at the moment it exits the horse. It's sterile, not after.
But noted, if I'm ever bleeding around a horse, just have it pee on me. I'll write that down.
You have to have a horse.
Take it with me.
Yeah. That apparently it works. And then they stitched him up, and a couple of days later, they had him back out there.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, they were, and they had,
okay.
And that whole
Just
movement, by the way, was called the Volksstrom. And the Volksstrom was the last solution of, Hitler's army, where they literally took the men 60 and older and the children down to technically only 16. But as we know from my father's experience, he was 14.
Okay. All right. This is what, beginning of 45?
Oh, no, that's the very end. I'm talking March 31st, 1945, the day before.
Okay, so, right. Okay,
yeah.
So you said he left on Christmas. I just didn't know what the time frame was.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the end of March of 1945.
Yeah.
I mean, Hitler gets killed, April 8th, I think it was, 1945, at least allegedly?
May. So he's still in war for a while. So if the unconditional surrender was signed at 11:01 p.m. on May the 7th of 1945.
Okay, that's right. April 30th was his death.
Yes. The Hitler.
Right.
Yes,
all right. So he gets sent back out. What does his next foray into combat look like?
So they get into additional. So they're actually retreating at this point.
I mean, at this point, he has to know that they're losing, right?
Yeah, now it's starting to dawn on them that things are really not at all like they had been painted.
Told they were.
Like they'd been told. They do engage in a few more battles, and then Field Marshal Hermann Goering actually showed up to give a reward to the troops, and that was obviously to boost morale and to get them to continue fighting the desperate fight. And his division, or what was left of it, was awarded the Iron Cross for bravery in combat. And so, of course, that actually technically had the desired effect, because again, he exhorted them to defend the fatherland, right? And so, like every good soldier, they were, that was their sense of duty to do that, and they believed in it, and they believed they had to defend Germany against the Russians, who were told, they were told the Russians were the aggressors. And so they continued, but they were now retreating. So what they started hearing rumors that, yes, in fact, the unspoken rumors nonetheless were, circulated, that Germany was not doing well, and that it was actually losing the war. And the retreat obviously was an indication of that. And they heard that actually what was left of the division was trying to do was get to the Americans. So they were trying to get away from the Russians and get to the demarcation line that was rumored to be in Austria, in the town of Lietzen. And north of the demarcation line was going to be the American side, and south of the demarcation line was going to be the Russian side. So there was this desperate attempt to get away from the Russians and go to and get to the American side. And they were not the only ones. So you were seeing in this retreat a mass exodus happening of civilians as well as military. In mile-long convoys going northwest in the attempt to hit that demarcation line to get to that city in time.
Okay. Does your father talk about the feeling that not only were they losing the war, but necessarily he survived near-death experience once, that he was going to be on the wrong side of it the second time around?
Yeah, and so at this point he's not aware he's on the wrong side, right? At this point he's only aware that his country, which he loves, of course, as any citizen of a country does, especially at that age, is in trouble. And that becomes plainly obvious that they are. At this point they realize they are losing, and they are hearing that the Americans are at least not going to torture them. So they understand, at least superficially, that's what is going to happen, right? That at this point it's inevitable. The loss seems inevitable, and that they're just trying to get away from the Russians to not get tortured and killed.
So how does it play out until the very end, as far as the combat is concerned?
So as they retreat, they see some pretty gruesome things, some of which my father never did, in fact, talk about. So some things he didn't tell, and the ones he did were bad enough. So they
would you be willing to share just a small tidbit of what that was like? I mean,
yeah. So they get to a village that actually had been taken back by the Germans from the Russians, right? They see this, devastation everywhere, and they get to this town that's actually been taken back by the Germans, and they get to a convent where the convent had been basically burned down, and all of the nuns had been raped and murdered by the Russians. So that's something that deeply, deeply traumatized him. When he saw it, he couldn't comprehend it, and he got sick to his stomach, and then he was pulled away by his lieutenant, and he says, look, we can't help them, But these are the things that obviously I think are very common to, unfortunately, to the war experience. These just atrocities that one is witness to and sometimes, unfortunately, participant in. And so they continue on their journey back, trying to flee. Then what they run into is German soldiers hanged from trees. This was also sadly very common. We're into April of 45. Germany is desperate. The war is in fact lost. And the SS would round up soldiers who had lost their units or who were alone. And they would consider them deserters, and they would kill them. So any soldier found not fighting at the front and wandering by themselves would immediately get rounded up and killed. And so they saw a German soldier who had been hanged, and they went into the town and actually spotted two SS who had just gotten a hold of a young German soldier and appeared to be interrogating him. So it was clear to them what was going to happen. So at this point, they're only, this division is, there's just a few men, I think 7, 8, 9 perhaps left. And the lieutenant gave him orders to ambush the two SS officers, and they killed them.
Really?
Yeah, they did. They said they couldn't. That was an insult too grave to bear, right? That their own would kill their own.
Yeah. I guess that's the ultimate sign that things are going poorly.
Yeah. At this point now, it's clearly obvious that, my father was already extremely wary of the SS because of his experience in that, in that children relocation camp, and how, creepy, right? And I completely forgot to tell a really, really shocking event when they went into that after the military training. They went back to the village for a while before they were actually shipped out. And at that point, there was so much hunger there. I mean, they had nothing to eat. They were starving.
Right.
And at that point, some of them were reduced to just stealing food wherever they could find it. So this kid, one of their schoolmates, actually went and stole butter and ham from the SS depot. He had found a way to sneak in, because the SS was stationed there because they were watching these kids, right? Every day they had handlers. They were watching them. They were watching every movement. And so this kid sneaks in and steals the butter and the ham, and he gets caught by the SS red-handed. And that infraction was punishable by death. And so the next morning, they rounded the kids up and made them watch as they executed this, 14-year-old boy by firing squad, to give him an example, to serve as an example, and for them to understand that, infractions and were not tolerated.
Okay. We get to the German surrender and everything, goes forward from there. What happens to your dad then? I mean, it's not as simple as say everybody just kind of went home,
Oh,
like
no.
everybody.
Oh, no. It gets worse. So they do make it though. They make it, and they don't even really know. They don't know the war's actually over. So by the time they reach Lietzen and they cross the bridge, so there's a river crossing the city, in the southern part of the city, and north of that bridge, passing that river, was the American side, or at least that was the rumor. I mean, it's not like they had cell phones, but they had some way of the officers had some way to find out. And the southern side was going to be the Russian side. So they cross the bridge into the northern side. They make it, and they spend the night in civilian homes, because civilians were mandated to open their homes and to host soldiers. So my father actually had ripped his pants, and so the lady at whose house he stays gives him a pair of pants and a cup of coffee, which was absolutely a luxury, absolutely unknown. So he found that, he reflected later that he felt there was still some kindness left in the world. And so the next morning, they go on exercises. So they have them do exercises. The next morning, shooting practice. And then he goes, and they come back into town, and he goes on a walk with a local, and he actually runs into Americans right in the middle of the town, like in the main square of the town. He runs into a Jeep, an American, he thinks it might have been a Jeep, and it was he called it a Fehlungsflak in German. I will explain it, and forgive my ignorance of military jargon.
Okay.
So basically it's a truck with 4 machine guns, each pointing in one different direction, right? And there were, I'm not sure how many, but probably at least 3 or 4 American soldiers, in that truck. And apparently they were relaxed, not expecting, anything to happen. And he remembers one of the American soldiers had rubber boots on, and it caught his attention because he had never seen such a thing, and he thought they looked strange, and that was something that he remembered to this day. And so he shows up. He's in full gear, so he's got his helmet, because he just went to shooting practice and they were fully in full gear, and he's got his uniform, his machine gun, his pistol, and they see each other. So The Americans see him, he sees them. He said he didn't, he froze, he did not pull his weapon, he didn't do anything. And the Americans turned around and left. So he goes running back to his command to tell his lieutenant what he's just seen. And as he gets there running, the lieutenant tells him, Langbein, it's over. We've lost the war. We've surrendered. Because it was that day, that morning was May 8th. So when they crossed the river to the American side that night, the surrender was signed. And they didn't know, they were unaware of it until, the next morning.
Is that the reason they suppose the Americans didn't do anything?
I think so, exactly.
Okay.
They didn't because the war was over.
Yeah. Okay.
So that explained that. So then there's, so it's huge commotion, people crying on the street. My father recollects just being basically just, rooted to the ground and not knowing what to do with himself, and it was a mixture of an immense sense of relief, but also uncertainty and apprehension, not knowing what was going to be next. And
I was going to ask you, not knowing what's going to be next, when does your father find out about the depths of what had gone on? Again, we talk about the Holocaust and the concentration camps, and then realizing that German soldiers and German leadership were going to be tried for war crimes.
Yeah.
So how does he stumble upon this reality?
Yeah, so it's sort of experiential and gradual, right? So he arrives, so they've eventually, they do give themselves up to so there's an agreement to give themselves up to the Americans, the officers get in touch with the rest of other commands or what was left of them. They go to an agreed to location to get taken prisoner by the Americans. The Americans do show up a few days later. At this point, they've had nothing to eat for days. They're taken to the Kirsteon camp, and it is a detainment camp. And it's interesting because they're taken prisoner after the war ended. So he explained to me that they couldn't be, they were not and could not be called prisoners of war. They were not POWs. They were interned persons. So it seemed as if the Americans didn't, quite know what to do with them. So they were in this open camp. It was an open camp. It had, a few barracks, but they were actually out in the open. And it was barbed wire, around them. And so they were there for a while, and there is the first time my father gets, exposed to any of this. Is he's the only one. My father was a very good linguist, so he already speaks English. He's the only one that speaks English. They find out he speaks English. And an officer calls him to his office, and unfortunately, it's pretty violent for him. It doesn't end very well.
Was this an American officer or a German officer?
An American
Okay,
officer.
okay.
His last name is Frank. It's actually on my father's military discharge papers from the camp. He signed it. Yeah. So, he, it's just the things that happen in war, right? He makes my father watch and translate while, he has intercourse with a German woman. And my father's so disturbed by it because he's Catholic and he's a child. I mean, and back then I think children were younger in their minds even than they are now. So he walks out, which was extremely dangerous. And so he's then punished by the officer, who actually turns out to be Jewish. Now, my father is not connecting the dots. He just sees the Star of David. And he sees the man is extremely angry. And then he's starting to piece together his discomfort when he was younger, what he was seeing about these whispers about you can't do business with Jews, and the yellow star, which is, he was asking his parents what that meant, and they never really wanted to talk about it. So he realized something, and then he sees this, and he sees this anger, and he's starting to suspect there's something really bad is happening, but he still doesn't get what or how bad. And then he does get led away, and he gets beaten to about an inch of his life. So he is beaten very brutally, almost to death. And then he does survive that beating. Most of the people in that camp actually die of starvation and of they are the only food there is that they're fed mostly is mildewed bread. And so mildewed bread causes dysentery. And so many of them die. Not most, but
how
many,
long
many
was
die.
he in this camp for?
Not that long. Luckily, otherwise he probably would have died. Not that long. I think they needed to triage folks to get them. So basically what they were then ended up doing. So he might have been there maybe a month or two, a couple of months.
Okay.
Because, about a couple of months. So till July, I think. They then get triaged out, and so the vast majority of them get sent to forced labor camps, right? So they get sent to France, to minefields, typically, and he gets lucky because he realizes that there are two lines, and he's listening to what the questions that these inmates are being asked, and he notices that when they say they're farmers, they're getting sent to another line. And so he thought really quickly on his feet. Half of his family, his mother's side of his family, were farmers, and so he was a quick thinker, and he thought, I have a feeling they're sending the farmers home because there's no food, so they're going to need farmers. So he takes this huge gamble, and when he's asked what his occupation is, he says student and farmer. He gets sent to the other line, and sure enough, his bet, was good. They do get sent home. The other guys get sent to the mines, to the minefields, and don't come back till 47 or 48.
By the way, do the Americans even know that he's only 14, 15 years old at this point in time? Has he ever divulged his age?
They did when they beat him. They in fact thought, wow, what a Nazi, he's so dedicated. You volunteered that young. So they beat him extra because of that, right? And so from the American side, it's understandable, it's war. So that's what they believe. That's what the Americans, of course, believe of him, right? He, in the end, I mean, that's the tragedy of war, and that's what happens.
Yeah.
So,
So he has had no contact with his parents up until he's about to get on a train to go back to be a student and a farmer.
Zero contact, okay. No contact whatsoever. So he gets put on a train. They get put on a convoy, very much like the Nazis put the Jews on the convoys. So it's exactly the same situation. It's a cattle car. It has no doors. It has a chain. They're packed so deep that they're like, sardines. A trip that should have taken a few hours, right? Maybe 5 hours, 6 hours, takes 14 days because all of the tracks have been destroyed, right? The Allied forces had made sure that they destroyed the infrastructure, right? So now it takes 14 days to get to Westphalia, back to his home. And that is a very traumatic journey. And actually, American soldiers are there, basically protecting them. At the same time, they're dying in that cattle car. So they keep having to push the dead out of the car as they die, right? Standing up, most of them. So it's pretty grueling. He is, again, relatively lucky, even though he said he didn't feel so lucky then, but because he was one of the last to be put in the car. So he's sitting basically outside. So he's getting, it's late spring, so it's warm enough. And he's getting fresh air. The ones in the back are suffocating, right? And so he's holding on to the chain. And so at one point, they're passing through the Netherlands, and the Netherlands was, of course, invaded, by Germany, as well as other countries. So they were very resentful. So there's a mob. At one point, there's a mob. The train is stopped. It stops constantly. It keeps stopping because the tracks are in very bad shape. And the mob arrives with knives and weapons. So they are going to kill them. And the American soldiers stepped in and protected them, because otherwise they would have been killed. So they shot in the air and they shot into the crowd to make them disperse. At one point, there is another situation during that journey where there is another train with American soldiers whom he believes were actually going, and I don't know how he would have known that, but they were being sent elsewhere. He thought maybe to Japan. Actually, they were getting deployed to Japan, and then that gets pretty ugly because the American soldiers on that train are starting to taunt, the guys in this cattle car, because of course they realize these are German soldiers, and so they're starting to taunt them, and they're trying to actually pull them out of the rail car, and they're pulling my father out. And my father's legs at this point are not working anymore because he hasn't moved. And so his legs are technically paralyzed. So he's no feeling in his legs. So he can't actually, fight back. And again, an American soldier saves the day, and he was very grateful. The American soldier stepped in and told the other ones to back off, and to leave them alone. So they eventually get to their destination in Düsseldorf, and because he has no longer any feeling in his legs, he can't move. So he's being told to get off the train, but he can't. And so he basically he gets pushed off and falls off, and then he half loses consciousness. So all he remembers is being thrown in a truck. And then he ends up in a British military hospital, where he is then eventually nursed back to health, by the British military.
Okay.
So at this point, he was
Unreal.
90 pounds.
No.
He was 6 feet tall.
I mean, again, I'm I don't think any of us listening and watching can fathom all this. And again, I'm not here to play, judge and jury on what was right, what was wrong at the time. I think that's a fruitless conversation, so I don't want to have it. But what I do want to try to understand, eventually your father obviously makes it home, right? I mean, obviously he gets home to his parents, and
Yeah.
When does the weight of, or when does he really understand what the whole war was about, and what he was fighting in defense of, and I quotation defense, what he was fighting in defense of, and sort of how does that weigh on him when he learns all of it?
Yeah, very heavily. So one other thing that happens in the internment camp, the American soldiers show them pictures of the concentration camps. And they're telling him, this is what you did, these atrocities, you're responsible, this is your fault. And the Germans, the kids especially, I don't know if the adults knew more, but they didn't understand it. They couldn't accept it. They didn't believe it. They thought it was propaganda. It was Allied propaganda. They said that this isn't possible. Like this couldn't possibly be true, right? So they were at that point. My father couldn't believe that he realized something bad had been done by the Germans to the Jews. At this point, he knows that, but he doesn't. When he sees tells me that when he saw the concentration camp pictures, he couldn't believe it. He said it couldn't possibly be true. So then, he makes it home. His town is completely destroyed. His house is gone. Everything's destroyed. He does not know where his parents are. He eventually does, find them, and that's, a whole other part of the story. But then he gets put into, he needs to report to the authorities when he gets there, and he is mandated 1 year of forced farm labor. So he's not done yet. So he does go and does his year of forced farm labor, after which he then eventually gets reintegrated into, whatever level of normality there was, and gets put back in school. So at that point, now he has missed the denazification process that was actually being done by the Allied forces in schools, because he was in a forced farm labor situation. Okay. So he's missed this. So he's still relatively clueless. But then he's being told. Now he's being told, and his teachers are telling him, and the same teachers that before were exhorting the virtues of Nazi Germany are now extolling the virtues of democracy. So my father now is starting to go, wait a minute. And then he has a discussion with his mother, who finally breaks down and tells him the story that I was telling you about the Jewish family. And she tells him the good news that Mr. Grünebaum did actually survive, and that they were able to successfully hide Mrs. Grünebaum and the child. But yes, she says, yes, this stuff really happened, right? And so then now he really believes it because his mother is telling him it's true.
Yeah. Well,
so now he gets it. Now he's now 15, 16, right? So he absolutely realizes the horrors, and he sinks into deep depression. He basically doesn't go to school anymore. He is, he has fits of anger. He feels violated, right? He feels that he was made to part of, these atrocities,
right,
without his knowledge, and he's this unwitting participant in this absolutely horrible event that he can't even wrap his head around. And so he feels, that everything he was told, he realizes was a lie. So when your entire world, crumbles, it's very difficult to pick yourself back up. Well, and then the PTSD.
Not only that,
happened,
I mean, he almost lost his leg. He was beaten severely several times within an inch of his life. He died almost several times over.
Yeah.
In support of something that was a complete lie. Yeah.
He was absolutely devastated. He was in a black hole, and he gets into a fight. He punches his school teacher. Actually, I think it was the principal. He punches the principal of the school. So he gets into some trouble, and then he actually is saved by sports and a British officer. So it turns out that, and I guess perhaps his sense of duty too, he was a very resilient man. He realized he's an only child, he's an only son. And he realizes at some level, his parents need him. He's going to have to be there for his parents at some point when they get old, because they're all, he's all they have. And so, and he's being told that there's this soccer association that's getting put together through the school, and in connection with or collaboration with British forces. So British forces and American forces, of course, have been told not to fraternize with Germany, and there was the President Truman's Joint Chief of Staff proclamation, I think it was 1067, that said that Germany was not to be helped to reconstruct, right, in the beginning at all. It was to be provided no assistance. and they were supposed to stay an agrarian state. By 47, I think it was right after the winter of 46, which is particularly brutal. They realized that Americans realized that Germany needed to rebuild its industrial base in order for the rest of Europe to be able to reconstruct. And so that was eased, right? So these restrictions were eased. So there was some fraternization now allowed. And in the vein of that, there was this soccer group that was formed, and this British soldier who was actually quite young, this officer, kind of took my father under his wing. My father spoke English well, and so they were able to converse. So, he taught him more English, and my father taught him more German. And this British officer gave him a bigger worldview. He told him, look, Germany and the other countries need to get reconstructed. They need people like you. Young men like you can help rebuild a better world. And so those conversations that he was having with that British officer helped him out of depression and helped him, see that maybe there was hope and there was something he could do. And this notion of building, a democratic Europe and rebuilding Germany to be part of that is something he found very inspirational, and he wanted to be part of it. And he did, in fact, do that. And so he moved on to become a lawyer.
Okay.
And ended his career as the head of NATO Legal Germany, and won.
Oh, wow.
And he won the Medal of European Merit in 1979, and it was granted or awarded to him by the Vice President of Belgium for his contributions to the furtherment of democracy in Europe.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good thing to to be awarded for.
Yes.
Congratulations,
Yeah.
that's amazing for him.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I wanted to fast forward a little bit, and at least because there's some other parts of this that I think we need to discuss. I would like to get to the point where, you're in the picture here, and Dad starts sharing these stories with you. How does that come about?
Yeah, he didn't actually. So
Okay.
he was a loving father, I had no question, but he was pretty incapable to show emotion. I mean, he was emotionally unavailable and very distant. And he was still, in the good old fashioned German way, quite authoritarian. Well-meaning, mind you, but disciplined, And so I could not fathom ever contradicting my father. I mean, I was very intimidated by him. He was not emotionally available. I knew he was loving and he was providing for us, but and he had nightmares every night. I could hear him. It often woke me up, and I didn't know why. But he would wake up screaming just about every night. And, I remember my mother always saying, no, it's just nightmares. Don't worry, it's nothing. And so not until I got much older, I realized, because of his age, I mean, I just realized, wait a minute, and as I was in high school, I was like, you were in the war. And he's like, yeah. And then and he started sharing just, the good parts, like the funny anecdotes, the things that weren't, and he did explain a little bit how tough it was in the war, and there was food, but he never spoke about his actual war experience. And I started bugging him about it. I said, you know what, just tell me. I think, I'm curious. I want to know what happened to you, right? And so he shared a few things, and I started realizing that he was traumatized, and that was probably one of the reasons why he was so aloof and so distant, and he buried himself in his work because he had determined that what happened should never happen again, and that was really his life's work, and that was all he was really focused on. So I'd say he handled his PTSD relatively well, in the sense that he turned it into a drive for doing whatever he could to improve the world, in whatever small way he could. And that's where he focused all his energy on that. And of course, that means he didn't have a whole lot of energy or time or attention left for us.
I mean, how do you begin to discover all that your father had went through?
I am ashamed to tell you that I didn't, until I was well into my adulthood, really realize the depth of, all of that had gone on. And that's when I started really,
But why are you ashamed of it?
Was that? Because he
it?
never got enough credit for the amazing work that he did. I mean, so I don't know, I think I had shared with you that, he authored the contract for the NATO fighter jet, or NATO, which is basically the gem of NATO, and is still in operation. Now they're retiring it, but it's still in operation in certain areas. And he authored that contract. He got the medal. I didn't appreciate, and he didn't talk. He was very humble too. He didn't really talk about it. So I didn't realize, first what he had gone through, and what he had overcome, and what he had turned it into. And I say I'm ashamed because I think I should have given him a whole lot more credit. My sister and I a lot more credit for what he accomplished. But I kept urging him, because I realized then, as I became an adult and more politically educated, I realized, how important it was to tell these stories, because history is hopefully how we learn. We need to keep history alive for future generations, right?
No, I mean, this is, history that I would have never known otherwise. I mean,
yeah.
So would a lot of our audience. I mean, it's a very personal history as well.
Yeah.
But so again, you talked about not finding out till later in life. How did you first start to uncover the depths of what your father had went through?
I just ran into a tape that it's an old cassette tape from like the early 90s, where I'm starting to try to interview him. not very successfully, but that's where I'm pinpointing this. So yeah, so I was, about 30. That's when I started to really piece things together. I had enough, I think, education and knowledge that I realized, and I started, seeing the world, I guess, with different eyes, and saw, how there are threats to democracy. And fast forwarding this, I kept urging him to actually tell me his memoirs or write them down. And he finally relented after he retired. After he retired, I think, as you get older, perhaps you think of, more of your legacy and of maybe
Sure.
what you want to leave behind and what you want to communicate. And so he taped it, and he taped 16 cassette tapes in German. And then he converted them to CDs, which for him was a big deal, because, he wasn't one to adopt modern technology. And he sent them to my sister and I in 2007. And so, I listened to him a couple of times, and, I thought it was incredibly fascinating. But then, life happened. So I put him away, because I thought, okay, I got it now. And then all of a sudden it's 2016, and my father's been put in a retirement home, and he's not doing well. And so I realized, and he's starting to get very concerned by, the world events, right? Geopolitical, situation.
Yeah.
He's starting to get more and more concerned, that his life's work, that his dedication to democracy was being threatened. That you could see authoritarianism rising in the world everywhere. And he was starting to get pretty distressed. And so I felt a sense of urgency to do something about it. And that is why, I never set out to be a writer, but I thought this was important enough that I had to figure it out. And so I put myself through a writing class, and I said, Dad, I'm going to make you famous. And he used to laugh. He did not believe it for a minute. And unfortunately, he did pass before I was able to publish the book. I was about halfway through.
Well, I wanted to ask you, so when you start diving into these tapes, how many conversations, how many opportunities do you have conversations about this and ask him questions and have some dialogue about it?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're sort of a global globetrotter family, so everybody's in a different place. So my parents were in Spain. My mother's still alive, and she is in Spain. And from that point on, toward the end of 2016, when I started until he passed in January of 2018, I had weekly conversations with him. I had weekly interviews. I told him I'm going to interview you every Sunday. So every Sunday you look forward to my call. It was evening over there, morning here, and I'd have 1-2 hour conversations with him, and he was very open. Except for certain areas, I didn't want to prod certain areas because I could tell, like he'd fall silent, or he would tell me, yeah, I can't remember, so I didn't want to push.
How emotional were those conversations for him?
Very, I think, very, but I think he knew. I think he knew it was the end of his life, and I think he was very happy that I expressed interest and I wanted to know, and he was happy to talk to me about it, but it was very emotional for him.
Did you, when your father tells you these stories about what he had gone through and everything else, and you growing up in a world knowing about the atrocities of Nazi Germany, and you put that two together, I mean, is there a part of you that couldn't believe that he didn't know what was going on? Is there a part of you that sort of doubted any of what he had told you from that standpoint? Because we grew up in a world where it's just, we know how awful this is, right? We have historical factual accounts, and the idea that,
Absolutely.
I guess we're just so ingrained that, well, they had to know. How could you not know?
Yeah.
Was there any moments like that you were just like, I don't believe this. Like, this is incredulous to me.
No, because he was so young. I know my grandparents must have known, at least certainly they knew there were camps. They knew that people were taken away, and not in a nice way. And they saw Kristallnacht, and they knew. They just, the issue was that the rule was fear and intimidation, right? The rule was by fear and intimidation. And so the German population was brutalized if there was any hint of dissent, right? So many neighbors of my grandparents were actually, disappeared, right? They were taken away, never to be seen again, because they happened to disagree with something. The first thing that usually happened is you lost your job. So you lost your way to make a living and to support your family. Then your food rations were taken away, so you couldn't eat. And then ultimately if you're male, mostly, you were dragged away and usually not to be heard of. So that's what happened when you disagree with the regime. So at some point, folks, go into survival mode, and they were like, well, I need to protect my family and my kids. I'm going to keep my head down, and I don't want to know what's going on.
Right.
I think that unfortunately that's, when regular people often, cave in the face of this because they fear for the lives of their children and their wives, and they feel and it's not, back then, obviously you didn't have the ability to globally travel as easily as you do now, and particularly in authoritarian countries where you're not even allowed to exit, right? You're not even going to be issued papers to go anywhere, and then where would you go back then? You're talking 40s. There is no mass communication. What they had was radio, and the radio was monopolized by the Nazis. Right? Hitler was a marketing genius for the time, and he was extremely good at indoctrinating and at propaganda dissemination, even in those days where there wasn't much in terms of media. He monopolized everything. So people were mostly trying to stay out of trouble. Right. I don't know how much, honestly, my grandparents knew, because I never talked to my grandparents about it. My grandmother died when I was 11, and my grandfather when I was 14, so I didn't have a chance. My father did tell me, when he was 8 was the first time he figured something was wrong. when he saw the Kristallnacht at the synagogue. And then there were these whispers, about the shoe store, where, he all of a sudden they weren't going there anymore. And why? And he was asking his parents, well, what's going on with, why does Mr. Grunenbaum have to wear this yellow star? And they were like, yeah, shut up and mind your own business. You don't need to know. And then it was known, he could see that the Jews were being singled out for something, and that they were being told that the Jews were not good people. That's what he remembered. But beyond that, he didn't, he was taken out to Constance when he was 13. So as it got really bad, he was out of the picture, right? He was in, a rural place, being handled by his Nazi handlers. So what exposure he had was limited to sort of rumor and innuendo, and so this feeling of uncomfortable, something not good is going on with Jewish people, and they're not being treated well. But beyond that, he really didn't understand. He did figure it out shortly thereafter, right? So by the time he gets back, he realizes, and he, to the end of his life, would watch, Holocaust documentaries. And I remember my father actually having tears in his eyes. I mean, in his late 70s, going, I still can't understand how we could have possibly, wrought this destruction and this happened.
Yeah. To that point, about the emotion of it, what was the most heartbreaking discovery for you? For you, hearing your father go through all this, it had to be emotional for you as well. What sort of was that, one of those stories or one of those moments that really got you?
Just the fact that the despair that he must have felt when he realized that everything that he had been told as a child, that his entire world view was this unbelievable atrocity, right? That he was part of it. That the depth of that despair, that struck me as something, just bottomless, right? And then I felt empathy, I felt a lot of empathy for anybody who is in that situation, in particular, to feel that sense of complete and utter despair, and you have nothing to hold on to, right?
Okay. I want to get to the part of the conversation that I think, some of our audience, or a lot of our audience, be very interested in. How many conversations did you have with your father about what had happened to him and the post-traumatic stress that he experienced, and how it was sort of not passed on, but deflected onto you, your sister, the rest of your family, because of what he had went through?
And I think that's common in soldiers, right? You're stoic about your experiences. You don't really talk about it very much, and then you just suck it up and move on. And particularly in Germany, he was not allowed to ever speak of anything. So he was strongly rebuffed by his parents. His father never spoke of it, not ever, not once. And his father was a World War I veteran who had fought in Verdun, and was almost lost his life. And so his father had gone through 2 world wars where that Germany lost. And so that was just not discussed. And his mother basically technically told him she didn't believe him, and he needed to not talk about it. And so he was told to move on, just suck it up, move on, don't speak of it ever. And that was really pretty much his his entire life's attitude until, the very end, where he opened up and he said, okay, well, here it is, I'm going to tell you what happened. The legacy we got was, I think what it did is it did instill in him an incredible sense of integrity and honesty and dedication to, to basically making a difference. And he instilled in me the belief that, even one person can make a positive impact.
I mean, are there times you think back to the way your father may have acted or something he may have said and something he may have did, and now with the benefit of hindsight, you recognize a lot of that was more due to what he had been through than necessarily who he was?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure certainly that stubborn determination, right? The stubborn determination to redeem himself, right? To even the balances, to kind of even out the balance in the universe, right? To give his contribution. That was just his overriding, almost maybe obsessive thought, right? And he also was, and he was hard, he was a disciplinarian, and he was, pretty unforgiving when it came to mistakes. And he drank way too much. He smoked like a chimney. I mean, he smoked 3 packs a day for his entire life, and
Wow.
and arguably, drank a lot. And I'm assuming that that part of that was because of the PTSD.
Do you have anything to reconcile about your father, about what had went on, or is this something that you can sort of separate, saying, look, that was his life, not mine, and or is there some sort of connection that you bear to this whole thing?
Well, there is that, yes, I do feel a sense of response. So let's start with Germany. The entire German nation, has the burden of collective guilt, right? So
Right.
that's a blanket, right? And that Germany pretty much owns and owns up to, to certainly to a certain degree. And that was present even when I was growing up. Now, I didn't grow up in Germany. I grew up in Germany only to age 8 because my father was in the foreign service. So we traveled a lot, and most of my growing up was actually in Paris. And so, and I went to the German school of Paris. So I wasn't as immersed in German culture, but in school, I remember the discussions about World War II, and they did tell us. And when I was 15, our field trip was to Munich, to the Dachau concentration camp, to teach us history, to teach us what happened. So we were definitely told exactly what happened. So we were not allowed to forget, and I think that's a good thing. And I feel, and that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book too. It's in defense of democracy, and it is my contribution, whatever little I can do to continue this knowledge. It's pretty shocking, actually. There was this survey that was done in 2020 nationwide here in the U.S. And it was commissioned by the Jewish Commission for Claims. I think it's called Claims Against Germany. And thousands of people between the ages of 18 and 39 here in the U.S. in 2020 were surveyed, and 63% didn't know that 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. And about, I think, 23% of that population that was interviewed actually didn't know about the Holocaust and thought it was a myth, or thought it was a myth, right?
Oh,
yeah. So I think it was 10% had never heard of it, and about 23%, and you can look that up. It was in NBC News. I think it was September 16th, 2020. It was put out. That was one of the articles that gave those statistics. But I mean, it's appalling, right? If you think about it. So 60% of people, between the millennials and the Gen Z, right, don't know that 6 million Jews were murdered. About 23% think it's a myth. 10% haven't even heard of it. That's very concerning, right? That's a disturbing statistic. And so to me, this is one small way that I perhaps can contribute to keep the information alive, right? To for the, this might sound sort of grandiose, but it's like the collective human memory bank, right? Has to be fed. And we have to ensure, and I feel a responsibility to pass that information on, And I think it's powerful that it's from the wrong side of history. And I'm elated to tell you that I've gotten actually a lot of supportive comments from the Jewish community, because the book is evidence that it happened. And so it is contributing to history, to the historical record, and to make sure that people understand that this really did happen, and the destruction and the horrors, were real, and that they happened, and that the country with an authoritarian rule doesn't just destroy other countries and other peoples, but it destroys itself.
Yeah. When you decided to write the book, obviously, again, never having written a book, like you said, neither have I, but, you may have started out with one intent to tell the story, but you got a different, result of that. Beyond telling your father's story, what was the biggest reason? And I mean, you talk so much about your father's message of democracy, and, given where we are in America today, it's probably more relevant now than we ever thought it was going to be. But
yeah.
Beyond that, was it just your father's message? Was it his story? I mean, what are all the things that went into writing it?
Well, you kind of nailed it. It wasn't, I didn't set out to write a book, and my initial instinct, it was an instinct that I thought this was an important story. I needed to preserve it. But in the initial stages, I wanted to preserve it for my family, right?
Right.
So my children speak Spanish fluently, but they don't speak German because they mutinied after 3 years of German school on Saturdays and said it was too hard. And now as adults, of course, they regret it. But anyhow, so I wanted to translate it. So what I set out first to do was to translate those CDs from German into English. And that was going to be it initially. And I just, at work, I have a colleague who is a writer, and I didn't know it at the time, but, I just happened to mention it to him, and he says, oh, no, that's a book. And you need to publish that because that's important. And, at first I thought he was crazy, and I laughed him off, and then he just persevered, and then he struck a chord, because I realized he was right. I realized that if this was maybe bigger than just, me, putting this out to the family, that indeed this was actually an important story, and that needed to be shared, and the public needed to be perhaps made aware of what happens when authoritarian rule is allowed to take over. And it can happen again. And I've gotten several folks' comments, which I find really intriguing. They're saying that this book should be read in middle schools and in high schools, because it's a fairly easy to read book, and it's written on purpose that way to make it accessible. And I wrote it, when when I set out to, okay, no, I really do need to focus on this message, right? I do want to send a message. I wanted to make it relatable to young audiences. And because it is written from my father's perspective, it's a memoir, so it's written in the first person from his perspective, right? From his tapes and from the interviews with him. I think it is relatable to young people because it's written by a child, right? By a young adolescent.
Yeah, no, and again, I think there's so much value to this story. I genuinely do, and that's why I wanted you to share it here. I think that there is, a lot to be learned from the whole thing, and just in general, not understanding the scope of what, had gone on in Nazi Germany. I mean, and in the bigger picture, from a point of, making a chronological note in history, the World War II generation is dying off, all of it.
Exactly.
And your father is gone, and many World War II vets are gone, and
almost all of them. Yeah.
Preserving this, story in perpetuity is, I think, critically important, so we can continue to learn from it. And again, I know the book you said was published overseas, and it's done really well. Are you expecting a different reaction here in the States? Do you think you'll uncover a different reaction from the American mindset as opposed to the European one?
So it was published by Pen and Sword Military, which is a UK publisher. Was published worldwide in all the English speaking countries, as well as all of Europe, and here in the US by Casemate. So Casemate is a military, it's a publisher that specializes in history and military history. And it has, it's nationwide distribution. So it's available, Amazon and bookstores of Barnes and Noble, etc. What I have seen is mostly very positive reviews, and again, what I'm very, very happy to see also from the Jewish community, I'm getting positive feedback because of the fact that it shows evidence. It's a piece of historical evidence, right? That the Holocaust happened, and that the things that are described here, produce basically that evidence. Right?
What do you think your dad would say about the book?
Well, I hope he liked it. I mean, I don't think he quite believed that I was going to pull it off. But I think he would like it, and I think he would see it the same way, because he had that concern. He shared with me the concern that political events were taking a turn, really for the worse, and that he felt, of course, at that age now no longer capable of doing anything about it. So every little bit we can do, to preserve democracy and to raise awareness. And to maybe just, encourage reflection is a good thing.
Did your mom read it?
So she is reading it in German, because my mother speaks French, Spanish, and German fluently, but she doesn't speak a word of English, which is why my mother and my husband get along famously, because they can't communicate with each other.
Well done. Smart move on your part.
Yes, so she's reading it right now.
She's reading it right now. Has she given you any feedback at all?
No, I have to call her and see how she's doing. So I only get to call her, but maybe once every 2 weeks or so at the retirement home.
You had mentioned your sister also had access to all these tapes and everything.
Yes. Yeah.
Did she help in any way, or she kind of just let you take the lead?
She kind of let me take the lead. She's 11 years my junior. And she is more, I think, emotionally affected by also by the loss of my father. And she was even close. She was a lot closer to my dad than I was. I mean, I was close to my dad. We had a good, cordial, close relationship. But she was closer because she spent more time living with him. I left the house when I was very young. I took off at age 18. I was out doing other things. And so I think she was too emotionally involved. So it has taken her some time. She she's just now starting to read the book.
Okay. Do you think that your father's experience sort of robbed you and your sister of parts of your relationship with him?
Oh yeah, no doubt. Yeah, there's no doubt. Again, that sort of emotional distance, that's just inability to really open up, and be, emotionally available, and, reduced the closeness. So there was always a distance.
Yeah. And that's got, I mean, listen, that's got to be hard to deal with. One of the things I think a lot of those who are dealing with PTSD is, you don't think about it, but there's a fear you could pass it on to your children, right? Your
Yes.
children can become the most affected parts of your struggles with PTSD, and I think it's important that we recognize that and talk about that aspect, which is another reason, again, why I wanted you to share this story, because for any of us who are dealing with it, the unintended consequence of it is that our children become detached from us as parents.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I think, yes, there was a lot of that fear, whether fully understood by him consciously or not. And I mean, there was no word for PTSD.
Yeah, well, listen, you said 2016 when you started this,
Yeah.
at least it was in our vernacular.
At least
then, right?
we knew.
We
It's like,
about it. Yeah.
it dawned on me one day. I'm like, well, oh wow, my father had PTSD.
Right.
And, it wasn't even verbalized, right? My father, I don't think, ever uttered those words,
No.
And in his mind, it was like, no, you just move on, get over it.
Well, the name of the book, again, Save the Last Bullet, Memoir of a Boy Soldier in Hitler's Army, and I still can't get over that whole Save the Last Bullet thing. That's that'll stick with me for a while. That'll be something that I'll always remember. You guys can get anywhere, obviously, as you said, wherever books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, everything else, wherever you find it. But again, this isn't the typical story that we've told, but you've certainly given us an experience of combat that we would not have been aware of. And, thanks to you for sharing it. Thanks to for your father, obviously, and how lucky are we all to have had him take the time to document all this stuff. Because a lot of us don't. We keep it buried inside and we don't discuss it. And the fact that your father did can continue to keep not only his story and everything he had to go through alive, but the after effects of it. So again, many thanks to you, and continued success with the book. And we hope that more people choose to read it. We only obviously scratch the surface of what the whole story is about, but certainly you tell it so well, and I appreciate you doing so.
Yeah, and thank you for having me and for allowing me the time here to tell the story. And I do thank my father for having had the courage to actually verbalize it, so that we can pass this information on to other people, and hopefully get these conversations going. I had feedback. There was a podcast that was done on one of the chapters, and there was feedback from, an American dad who said that he and his 13-year-old son and his schoolmate had a discussion about what it would be like if they, got told that they needed to go to war and given a machine gun and told to go in the foxhole. And so that's the type of discussion I think that is productive to have, right? To have folks maybe reflect on the consequences of going into an armed conflict, right? Of even starting one, right?
Well, and also the consequences of not having a democracy where
absolutely
people are not allowed to have the free will to make the decision to not have to go into
and
combat.
We see it unfortunately in the Ukraine today, right?
Yes, still, unfortunately. Well, again, Willie Langbein, we send you thanks from below up above, and continue to keep you in our thoughts. And Heidi Langbein-Allen, thank you so much for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.